All right, let's turn now to the natural law, which Aquinas' kind of first pass at, kind of very general understanding of what it is. It's the eternal law as it applies to us. So, in a previous video, when we were looking at the eternal law, one of the examples I gave you was the eternal law as it applies to ducks, right? That doesn't get any special name. What we're considering now under this special name of the natural law is simply the eternal law, not as it applies to ducks or quarks or electrons or anything like that, but the eternal law as it applies to us, rational human beings. That's the natural law. That's the first way we can kind of understand it. And so the things that we were saying about the eternal law and how it applies to ducks and what exactly that might mean and how God's this kind of craftsman of the universe, all that can kind of be imported into into your understanding of natural law. And we're going to kind of get back to um, those kinds of ideas later on. But what I want to do right now is remind you of some of kind of where Aquinas is coming from. So I'd also like to remind you of the fact that the reason we're kind of going into it right now is that this is one of the moral considerations that we find in our culture today. There are certain people who appeal to the natural law to explain why certain things are right or wrong and so on. And we saw that in the abortion debate. And we saw that in particular in the in Evangelium Vitae, written by Pope John Paul II. He argued or claimed that abortion violated the natural law, and so abortion was immoral, something like that. And Pope John Paul II, in his discussion there, cited this passage from the Bible, which we looked at when we were looking at those selections from Evangelium Vitae. He cited Romans 2:14-15, and Aquinas cites Romans 2:14-15 in his discussions of the natural law. Very quickly, what does it say, and what is the sense again? Romans 2:14-15, St. Paul writes, when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature observe the prescriptions of the law. So the Gentiles in this case are the people who aren't Jewish, and so aren't practitioners of the Jewish religion, who don't have the law. What does that mean? They don't read the scriptures, the Jewish scriptures. They don't know about them. They don't know about Moses. They don't know about the Ten Commandments, right? They've never heard about this law. They don't have the law, right? But when they observe the prescriptions of the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. So what Paul is aware of is that Gentiles, Jews who have never heard, or non-Jews who have never heard of Moses or the Ten Commandments or anything like that, they might nonetheless, not ever having heard of this, of Moses and the Ten Commandments and so on, they might refrain from killing people. They might refrain from stealing. They might honor their mother and father. They might, they might refrain from coveting their neighbor's goods and so on. Right? That would be them observing the prescriptions of the law. They're refraining from coveting their neighbor's goods. Well, even though they don't have the law, they've never seen that commandment. They don't know the story of Moses. Well, St. Paul is saying they're a law for themselves. They show that the demands of the law are written in their hearts, right? So the demands of the law, don't kill, don't steal, don't covet thy neighbor's goods, that's written in their hearts. That's why they can follow it. And their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even defend them, right? So St. Paul here is referring to this law that's written in one's heart and that doesn't require any special revelation to know. Right? The Gentiles, by definition, are the people without this special revelation, to whom nothing has been revealed. And yet they know this law. Why? Because it's written on their hearts. It's written on every human being's heart. Right? That's the idea. Aquinas takes Paul to be referring to what Aquinas calls the natural law. This law that's written on people's hearts, that anyone can follow, that you don't need any special revelation from God to know, that's the natural law. What Paul is talking about, though he doesn't use the phrase, is the natural law. And Aquinas, his theory of the natural law, his exposition of the natural law, it comes in question 94, but from that whole question, it's really Article 2 that contains his theory of the natural law. That's when people talk about Aquinas on the natural law, they have 94.2 in mind. This is perhaps the second most famous passage from the entire Summa Theologica. The Summa Theologica would fill a bookshelf, or at least a shelf on a bookshelf. This is question 94, Article 2, is the second most famous passage from that entire thing, from that entire shelf of work. The most famous passage would be Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God. You may have read those in Phil 130, or at least one of them. They're called the Five Ways. That's probably pretty clearly the most famous passage from the Summa Theologica. This is probably the second most famous, though. Question 94, Article 2. And so we're going to spend some time kind of going through 94.2 in some detail. And the first thing that Aquinas turns his attention to in question 94, Article 2, is how the natural law is known. And in his view, the natural law is known by reason. And as we're going to see, he's going to claim something like it's self-evident. And so everybody knows it. It's known just by reason. You don't need God to come down and tell you. You can just think about it and figure it out. It's known by reason. And this is the sense, according to Aquinas, in which it's written on everyone's heart, because it's known by reason. Everyone can figure it out just using their reason. When Paul says it's written on everyone's heart, this is the idea. This is the sense in which it's written on everyone's heart. And the implication of this idea is that you don't need to be religious, right? The Gentiles weren't religious, and yet they knew the natural law. You don't even need to believe in God. Gentiles back then, I don't know, they probably had their own gods, right? They would have been the kind of pagan Romans, pagan Greeks, and so on. So perhaps they believe in their God, but you don't even need to believe in God. You certainly don't need to believe in the God that Aquinas believes in, or that Paul believes in, to know the natural law. You don't need to be religious. You could be an atheist, agnostic. You can figure it out just using reason. That's the idea, because it's written in everyone's heart. Everyone can figure it out using their reason. Now, I just want to show you really quick. Oh, this isn't going to work. Oh, there we go. Here is question 94, Article 2. We are going to spend a lot of time going through the I respond. These first two paragraphs of the I respond are where Aquinas talks about the way that the natural law is known, how it's known by reason. I'm not going to read it through. You can read it on your own time, but we're going to go through this pretty much in order. And then in subsequent videos, we're going to keep going through 94.2 all the way to the end. We're going to go through this entire I respond section, essentially. I'm not going to read it in the videos, but you can kind of follow along by going through 94.2. All right, now back to... All right. So it's known by reason, it's self-evident. But yeah, but what exactly does that mean? How exactly does that work? Aquinas has this huge, long paragraph in which he describes this. Now, it's a little bit tricky, actually, because Aquinas never really draws out what the conclusion is, or how exactly all the material discussed there in that paragraph that I just highlighted, how he never draws out how exactly it applies to the natural law. I'll do that for you, but Aquinas is not, unfortunately, he's just not terribly clear about it. The way he proceeds is by claiming that the natural law is known per se. And what he means to be saying there is something like it's kind of self-evident. It's known in itself or according to itself, something like that. It's known per se. It gets trickier, though, because he's going to argue, he's going to claim that there are two senses of knowing something per se. And so we need to clarify what these two senses are. And what he spends most of that paragraph that I highlighted doing is explaining these two senses. But then he never brings that back to the natural law. He never applies these two different senses to the natural law. That's what's kind of confusing. Let's start with the first sense of knowing something per se. A thing can be known per se in its own right. When we talk about knowing something per se, we can mean it's known per se in its own right. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, Aquinas clarifies. Something is known per se in its own right when the predicate is part of the notion of the subject. Well, okay, those are more words, but I don't know, that you're just making it more confusing. Now there's just more words that I don't know what they mean. The idea here is actually somewhat, I won't say easy, but manageable. Here's what he's getting at. I'm going to use this example. Aquinas uses a different example. I'll talk about Aquinas's example after I talk about mine. I think my example is a little bit clearer. Aquinas is kind of confusing. But Aquinas' example will be easy to understand once we use my example here. So the claim that all bachelors are unmarried. This is going to be a claim that is known per se in its own right. Aquinas would say that. He would say that that claim, all bachelors are unmarried, the predicate is part of the notion of the subject, and that's why it's known per se in its own right. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, let's isolate what the predicate and the subject are. Bachelors is the subject, right? It's a grammatical subject. It's the subject of the sentence. In that sentence, we're saying this subject, namely the bachelors, are unmarried. Are unmarried is the predicate. We're predicating unmarried of the bachelors. That's why the bachelors are the subject, and unmarried is the predicate, right? Unmarried is predicated of the bachelors. That's what's going on in that claim. All bachelors are unmarried. Okay, so that's what the predicate and the notion or the subject would refer to. That's maybe helping a little bit, right? What on earth is the notion of the subject, though? Well, it's basically the definition. What is a bachelor? It's an unmarried male, right? That's the notion of that subject. So the subject is bachelor. The notion of bachelor is unmarried male, right? The definition of bachelor is unmarried male. And so why is all bachelors are unmarried known per se in its own right? Because the predicate unmarried is also found over there in the notion of the subject, in the definition of the subject. And so the idea here, this is self-evident. This is what Aquinas is saying. This is self-evident. This is known by reason. You don't need to, you can just sit down and think about it. And true, I know that that's true. I don't have to go talk to a single bachelor. I don't need to go interview bachelors asking them if they're unmarried or not. No, because the predicate unmarried is contained within the notion of the subject, within the definition of bachelor, I know that this claim has to be true, right? All bachelors are unmarried, self-evident. That's what Aquinas is getting at. This claim is known per se in its own right because the predicate is contained within the subject. It's contained within the definition of the subject. Same thing could be said if I said all bachelors are male, right? Then the predicate would be male, and male is also contained within the notion of the subject, right? And so in general, definitional truths are going to be known per se in their own right. That's what Aquinas' example is. Aquinas' example is something like a man is rational. I think that's the way you put it. But the idea, right, whatever, human beings are rational. And is that a definitional truth? Well, it is, because according to Aquinas, the definition of a human being is rational animal. That's the notion of the subject human being. He thinks that's the correct definition of a human being. It's a rational animal. And so we find the same exact thing, right? The predicate rational is contained within the notion of the subject. And so Aquinas would say human beings are rational. That's known per se in its own right. Why? Because the predicate is part of the notion of the subject. It's self-evident. It's like all bachelors are unmarried. Okay. That's the first sense of knowing something per se. Knowing it's per se in its own right, right? It's self-evident. But what Aquinas recognizes, and this is what the second sense of knowing something per se is that something like human beings are rational, while it is the kind of thing that can be self-evidently known, it's the kind of thing that can be known per se in its own right. It's not known per se to everyone. And in particular, it's not known per se to people who don't grasp the proper definition of human being. If you had a different, so focus on Aquinas' example, human beings are rational. If you have a different definition of human beings are rational, you're not going to think that that's self-evident, right? If your definition of human being is a featherless biped, right? Something without feathers that walks on two legs, you think that's the proper definition of a human being. Well, human beings are rational is not going to be self-evident to you. It's not going to be self-evident as regards you, even though it is in fact self-evident, known per se in its own right. Because if you have the proper definition, if you grasped the proper definition, you would see that the predicate is indeed contained within the notion of the subject, right? If someone does not grasp the relevant definition, they're not going to know the claim. They're not going to know it per se. It's not going to be self-evident to them. If you didn't know that bachelors were unmarried men, all bachelors are unmarried is not going to be self-evident to you. It's only if you grasp the correct definition, right? That's Aquinas' point. And so something could be known per se in its own right, but not known per se as regards us if we don't grasp the correct definition, right? So if you don't grasp the definition of human being, you think the definition of human being is featherless biped, human beings are rational is not going to be self-evident to you. That's Aquinas' point. And so there are these two different senses of knowing something per se. Known per se in its own right, that's just kind of whether or not the thing is such as to be known self-evidently. Is the predicate contained within the proper notion, the proper definition of the subject, the true definition of the subject? If the predicate is contained within the true definition of the subject, well, then it's known per se in its own right. But in order to know it per se, you've got to know the proper definition, right? And so if you don't, the thing's going to be known per se in its own right, but not known per se as regards you. That's the distinction he's drawing. Now, so we have those two senses of knowing something per se. Aquinas, after kind of explaining both those senses, just moves on to talk about something else, doesn't apply any of it to the natural law, and so leaves it kind of like, well, what does any of this have to do with the natural law? I think it's pretty clear that what Aquinas thinks is that the natural law is known per se, both in its own right and as regards us, as regards everyone. And he's got to say something like this because this is really what, so certainly St. Paul doesn't put in these words, but this is the kind of idea that St. Paul is getting at, right? Paul is saying everybody has this law written in them. And so it's, and so Aquinas wants to say, well, what he's getting at there is we know it by reason, but it's got to be known by everyone by reason, right? Everyone's got to be such as to, so it's not going to be like the human beings are rational because not everybody grasps that. And Aquinas is aware of that. Not everybody grasps the proper definition of a human being. But the natural law is going to be known per se in both senses. And so that's going to mean that it's self-evident, it's known per se in its own right, but also that it's known by everybody. It's not going to be something like human beings are rational, where you have to like know something about human nature, right? Know the proper definition of this thing. And not everybody knows the proper definition of the thing, right? It's got to be something where everybody grasps the relevant definition. The natural law does, right? It's going to be self-evident. It's going to be self-evident to everybody. It's going to be known per se in its own right, and it's going to be known per se as regards everyone or to everyone. That's the only way to really make sense of the 214:15, right? And that's what Aquinas thinks. So the natural law is known per se in both senses.